Right. Well, hello everybody. We've got over 200 people already joined. There might be a few more that come along, but we'll make a start. Welcome to this IEEP UK webinar on the regulation of PFAS, exceptional chemical, exceptional regulatory pathways. My name's Colin Church, and I will be chairing today's webinar. I am the Chief Executive of the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining, which is a professional body based in the UK. I have a number of other roles across non-executive functions, and historically I was a British civil servant and had a lot of involvement in the early days of the EU regulatory regime for chemicals, which is, I guess, kind of why I'm here now. I'm joined by a very distinguished panel of experts, and we will go to each of them in turn. We'll have a few minutes from each of them, some discussion on the panel, and then we'll be opening things up to the audience for questions as well. As it says in the chat, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. That's where we'll be looking for them as we come to them. Any questions in the chat, I'm afraid we probably won't spot. So why have we decided to have a webinar talking about PFAS? And why are we taking it from this perspective of the history and current status of PFAS regulation in the UK and the EU? I think because we feel there's some interesting lessons to be learned about how one approaches this kind of chemical. And hopefully that will come out through the presentation. And hopefully also the Q&A will bring to light some more perspectives on how one should regulate this particular group of chemicals. And of course, PFAS pollution, forever chemicals, is the topic of much public attention nowadays, something that is growing in interest across all of the EU and the UK and beyond. And so it's perhaps a very appropriate moment for those reasons too. And then here in the UK specifically, we recently had an Environmental Audit Committee inquiry. It's a committee of the House of Commons in the UK Parliament, which looked at the issue of PFAS pollution, and that has certainly pushed up the political agenda on this issue in the UK. And of course, IEEP UK provided some evidence towards that. And I hope you will all have clocked the piece of work that Nigel Haigh has done looking at the timeline of that. And in fact, he'll come in a moment to have to give us an overview of his work in that space. I think it's also worth just noting in passing that this year is IEEP UK's 50th anniversary. The organisation's been around a long time and has been hugely influential in conversations around environmental policy across the EU and the UK, and has had a reasonable involvement in chemicals policy across that time as well. I had the fortune to be at the IEP Spring Reception recently, which was hosted by Toby Perkins, chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, and it was really interesting to hear some people reflecting on their experience of the influence of IEP and how that is continuing to be important in areas such as this. So that's enough of the introductory blurb from me. Just a reminder that if you've got any questions as we go through, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try and get to them towards the end. I'm going to start off by giving the floor to Nigel. Nigel is many things. I consider him to be one of my friends, but more importantly, he's an honorary fellow of IEP and indeed one of the founder directors of it. He's been involved with the Office for Environmental Protection in the UK. He's been involved with Chemtrust, an NGO that works on chemicals issues at the European level, and lots of other things, which make him uniquely qualified to talk to us today about his new piece of work, The Long Road to Regulating PFAS in the EU and UK. Over to you, Nigel.
You don't have to do anything. Thank you, Colin. PFAS is exceptional because it is a very large family of chemicals, and this presents considerable problems for regulators because the legislation on chemicals that we've developed over the last 50 years or so is all based on the idea that you test chemicals one by one, and then you restrict them one by one. And to do that for a family of 10,000 chemicals is obviously almost impossible. The first two PFAS to be restricted, PFOS and PFOA, were restricted one by one. And the first one was done fairly quickly. The second one took 10 years. So if you were going to go through thousands of them one by one, it would be very difficult indeed. The story starts in the beginning of this century when 3M, the American company, the largest producer of PFOS, announced that because of concerns raised in America, they were discontinuing the production of PFOS, but they continued with PFOA. That decision prompted a meeting within the OECD of its chemicals group, and they decided that they would conduct an informal hazard assessment of PFOA, with the United States and the UK taking the lead. The UK then decided to go a bit further. They commissioned the Environment Agency to do a risk assessment of the kind required by the existing EU legislation. And they announced publicly that they were going to ban PFOS unless the EU decided to do the same. And to cut a long story short, they succeeded, and the EU banned PFOS in 2006. So the UK was a leader then, and it has ceased to be that. What happened next was that REACH was adopted 1 year after that PFOS ban, and the burden of dealing with it, dealing with PFOA, moved to ECHA, which, as I said, took 10 years before it restricted it. And the reason I've understood for long delays was that it was fiercely resisted by industry, who argued that PFOA wasn't bioaccumulable to the degree needed to restrict it under REACH. Obviously, those arguments were overcome because it was restricted, but it just shows the difficulty of dealing with one particular PFOS. Now, when the Environment Audit Committee announced that it was doing an inquiry at the beginning of last year, I was rather hoping that among the evidence produced, I would find an explanation why it had taken so long. And I was disappointed nobody discussed that. So that motivated me to write the timeline, which has now been distributed. And all I can do now is to highlight some of my findings. Next step after the restriction of PFOA in 2017 was the political declaration by the Council of Ministers in the EU calling for a phase-out of all PFAS. Quite how that happened is not yet fully explained, certainly to me. I can imagine quite discussions inside ECHA. I can imagine intense discussions among 5 motivated countries, including Germany, who 2 years later announced that they would make a formal proposal for restricting PFAS, a universal ban on PFAS, which they did. The Commission, in the meanwhile, had published its chemical strategy supporting the Council's phase-out. So that was the EU position, and that has now developed, and we hear that ECHA's committees have made formal positive reactions to the proposal, and we expect a decision by the Commission, possibly this year, but don't hold your breath because there is much resistance to it. Now, what I've left out is a key development, which is the new concept of PMT, persistent, mobile, and toxic, which was developed by UBA, and we're fortunate to have Michael Neumann here with us to tell us how that happened. They started work, I think, in 2009, and by 2015, Michael and his colleagues had published the proposal, the concept of PMT, based on research which showed that although PFAS or some chemicals might not be particularly bioaccumulable, they were very mobile through soils and thus got to groundwater, which affects human drinking water, so it affects human health. It was the Environment Agency who said to me that it was the PMT concept which paved the way for dealing with PFAS as a group. So you didn't have to do them one by one. To do them one by one, you had to prove that each one had fitted the criteria of REACH. To do them as a group, you didn't have to do that, but you had to show that it was either PBT or PMT. And most PFAS are, I believe, very mobile, so they are likely to fit PMT. So the restriction that is going to come out of the Commission shortly, we hope, will probably be based both on PMT and PBT, and probably the precautionary principle as well, because we cannot know whether every single one of those chemicals is sufficiently toxic on its own. So that is the EU story. The UK story was that there was total silence politically after they banned PFOS. They did not support the EU restriction, the EU call for phasing out PFAS, because at that time the UK was withdrawing from the EU and didn't want to comment on EU developments. That's what I've deduced. They stayed pretty silent, really, until the Environment Audit Committee called for evidence, and this prompted the UK to produce its PFAS plan, which has much interesting and original things in it, but is not ambitious in the sense that it doesn't support a universal ban like the EU one. The Environment Audit Committee, on the other hand, has effectively done so, saying that the UK should stay aligned with the EU and get a move on in restricting chemicals, restricting PFAS, except for essential uses. So it is probable the UK will look at the EU restriction when it comes and will well follow it. So to sum up, we have moved to the point where I'm nearly going to do them all after 20 years, but it would not have been possible without the PMT concept, which paved the way for the grouping of all PFAS together. So that is the message for my contribution, and we're very lucky to have Michael Neumann to say more about PMT.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. Yes, Michael, you've been set up very nicely by all of that. So just a brief introduction. Dr. Michael Neumann works for the Umweltbundesamt, the UBA in Germany. She's the German Environment Ministry, and he works in its Department of Chemical Safety. And he's an expert in environmental exposure, such as PBT and increasingly the new concept of PMT. Michael, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see already the full screen?
No, yes, that's the full screen showing now.
Okay, perfect. So it's really an honor to be invited and to speak here. Thank you very much, and just thank you for your kind words, Nigel. I think I have to disagree with you that it was only the PMT concept that paved the way, but we can discuss later. So as you can see, I work in the REACH section of the German Environment Agency. And to set the scene a little bit for my contribution is that I talk about the identification and classification of an intrinsic hazard. And under REACH, this is triggered by the tonnage bans. And we basically look at three types: the physical chemical properties, the human health properties, the environmental properties. And this hazard classification is mainly done by the manufacturers, importers, and downstream users themselves. It's called self-classification under CLP. And it's always the starting point for exposure assessment and risk assessment and hazard communication. And to look a little bit in the history of PMT, it's really not me or not UBA that invented this idea and this concept. If you look in the literature, you really see that for decades, and this slide is already a decade old, so I really mean decades, scientists highlighted the hazard caused by persistent and polar contaminants. And they named these chemicals to express this hazard. So they called them polar POPs to distinguish from the normal POPs, from the bioaccumulative POPs. Persistent polar organic pollutants, PPOPs, persistent polar pollutants, so P3 substances or PPP substances, or persistent mobile organic pollutants, PMOX. So it's really a little bit funny to say that just by inventing a new name, we gave these chemicals, we add a drive to this regulation of these chemicals. And yes, Nigel, it started 2009. You see on the right side a poster on a very small German conference. And then it was 2012 on the German CTEC where I first used this word PMT, and then 2050, as you correctly said, we showed it to CTEC Europe. We discussed it on the scientific level. After that, we published papers and had a lot of consultation workshops. And here we are just a few years later. Since April 2023, we have new hazard classes in force in Europe. And it's not only the PMT that has been moved into the CLP, also the PBT and the endocrine disrupting hazard classes have been implemented. And you see on the lower side of the slide, the long transition period that has been given to industry is now coming to an end. So after 1st of November this year, every chemical on the European market has to be self-classified into these new hazard classes. This slide is a little bit complicated, but I'm trying to make it very simple. We asked Hans-Peter Arp and Sarah Hale in a research project, which was published 2023, to look in the literature, which chemicals are contaminating our drinking water relevant media, so bank filtration, groundwater, raw water, drinking water. And if you look in the upper right corner, you see that nearly half of them are REACH chemicals, are REACH registered chemicals. And if you look on the left side, the pie chart, you see that from all REACH chemicals, only 1.9% have PMT, VPVM properties. So it's the dark red that you need to look at. But from these 1.9, this percentage, 1.9%, it increases dramatically if you only look at the REACH chemicals that are contaminants, water contaminants. It goes up to 24%. So you can say that the likelihood of an PMT substance under REACH is 13 times higher to contaminate the water. So we look at the right chemicals here. So the intrinsic substance properties do matter, and they are a proxy to risk of these chemicals. And in my view, it's the persistency. It's the persistency that turns a temporary hazard into a permanent hazard. And I think you can say it's the most severe hazardous intrinsic property, as it may cause irreversible and increased environmental impact. The second intrinsic property, like bioaccumulation or mobility, distinguish only about the fate and behavior and the route of exposure. And maybe, Nigel, this is what you're referring to. But up to then, people were only looking at persistency and bioaccumulation. And there was this idea that any other persistent chemical is not a hazard. But by adding the mobility, we had something like the sister concept, and then it slowly grew the idea that every persistent chemical is hazardous. So we really should focus on finding, confirming, and managing persistent chemicals. And going back to the CLP new hazard classes, you see the hazard statement below. So they are called, can cause very long-lasting and diffuse contamination of water resources. And it's really the combination of persistency and mobility. These intrinsic substance properties allow these chemicals to spread to the sources of our drinking water. Such a contamination may be irreparable because these chemicals break through filters and they survive drinking water treatment. And it's impossible to predict the long-term effects of an emission because entry point and possible effects are decoupled in time, both in time and in space. So looking a little bit closer to the properties, to the criteria that are looked at, it's basically the persistency and the toxicity we took over from the PBT criteria, and it's only the mobility that was invented new. This is clearly based on the organic carbon fraction and the partition coefficient between water and soil. So it's basically the adsorption. These chemicals do not adsorb, and this is why they run with the water. And Nigel, it's not only the leaching to soil, it's also, for example, bank filtration that cannot hold these chemicals back. And under CLP, the mobility or very mobility properties are of concern and classified as a hazard only in combination with persistency and with persistent properties. So not the mobility itself is classified. And this is often misreported by people that all mobile chemicals are a problem. It's really the persistence one that are a problem. And the advantage of these criteria are that for an industry, it's really important to have a consistent, reliable, and non-costly numerical cutoff parameter based on an easy to assess intrinsic substance property. So again, the log KOC value is a very clear defined intrinsic property, and it really helps industry to have such a clear criteria. So coming to an end, I want to show you two things. One is the OECD set up an ad hoc working group in the last 2 years to look how persistent and mobile substances should be taken into account as a potential hazard class under the UN GHS. So this group, which I was a member of, reviewed criteria, methods, and definitions in the UN GHS, but also looked at outside the GHS. And the finding is that the existing hazard classes in the GHS do not adequately capture the long-term hazard. And the PMT VPVM hazard classes are complementary to those already established in the GHS rather than inconsistent with it. And the recommendation of this ad hoc working group was to implement definition and criteria for P and M in the GHS, implement clear criteria, use of existing standardized methods, and reducing synonyms and avoid unambiguous terms in the GHS. And my last slide is breaking news slide. I'm also a member of the Risk Assessment Committee of ECHA, and we had our 77th meeting last week, and we actually classified the first chemical into these new COP hazard classes, and it is TFA, the trifluoroacetic acid. It is actually a proposal by me and my agency. So it's a German proposal together with the BFR. So TFA is, in the view of RUC, toxic to reproduction based on effects on development. So it's category 1B, and it's a PMT VPVM substance. And with this, I really would like to thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Really helpful discussion of some of the issues around PMT and what it means in this context. So that's something from the perspective of the German Environment Agency and the work that's been done there around PMT. The next speaker I'm going to come to is Matt Womersley, sorry. And Matt works at the Environment Agency, where he manages the Chemicals Regulatory Development team. And I think you're going to say a little bit about the UK and England experience. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I'm going to talk about the Environment Agency experience of regulation. So this is sort of the hard end of things. Sort of a lot of the great work that Michael's talked about has been done. The Environment Agency is the primary regulator, environmental regulator, sorry, for England. So we don't cover Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. We're just focusing in on England here. What we do in terms of chemicals is the sort of 5 core things. We're assessing environmental risks of chemicals. We're monitoring extensively on that, particularly with PFAS. We've got one of the world-leading monitoring programs, PFAS in water, but we're also looking at soil and some biota. We're obviously a regulator, so we regulate industrial emissions and discharges. And because we're a regulator, we also enforce compliance with environmental law. Critically as well, we are an advisor to UK government. So this was sort of mentioned at the head of the call by Nigel. Examples of what we do around, well, I'll come to, but we're obviously advising on the government's PFAS plan. What I want to point out right at the beginning is we don't have any specific PFAS regulations. What we are relying on, like most regulators, is what the existing legislation to control environmental risks. So that means that PFAS presents some challenges for us as a regulator. So I'm going to go through, just give an overview of those the main regulation that the Environment Agency is involved in. So from top, it's already been mentioned, is REACH. So after Brexit, the UK government adopted EU REACH, and it's now into UK REACH. HSC, the Health and Safety Executive, leads on that piece of legislation. We are a statutory environmental advisor to the HSC. So we advise obviously on the environmental risks of certain substances. And so through that, we support restrictions and authorizations for PFAS. So examples of that at the moment is the proposed restriction on PFAS in firefighting foams, and also a significant contribution to the HSC's regulatory management options analysis to make those recommendations to government. I don't think it's been mentioned, but obviously, if those are close to working with PFAS, some PFAS have been listed as persistent organic pollutants under the Stockholm Convention. This goes back to Nigel's point. This is a one-by-one process with these chemicals, but it is an important piece of legislation that is implemented in England, and we are the competent authority for that. I would make the point, this has been made about the grouping things. POPs does use a groupings approach. So we do have PCBs, we have short chain chlorinated paraffins, and we have medium chain chlorinated paraffins. But these are much smaller groups and much more similar chemistry than, you know, this ever expanding group of substances known as PFAS. So through the persistent organic pollutants, we've obviously got restrictions that the Environment Agency can enforce in terms of particularly in things like PFOA and PFOS. But we can also regulate that through waste, because it's tighter restrictions on and controls on waste containing POPs, including PFAS, are in place, which does require destruction, and it cannot be recovered or recycled. Fundamental to a lot of what the Environment Agency does are the environmental permitting regulations. So this is probably our biggest challenge at the moment. These are regulations to control certain industrial emissions, waste activities, water discharges. So an operator gets a permit, and through that permit we can control certain emissions to the environment. It's all very much based on risk, but fundamental is we need certain standards. So to enable us to control the emission of a particular substance to the environment, to air, to direct to water, we need standards. And if those are statutory standards or limits, that makes our job a lot easier. So we've only got one such standard at the moment, which is a water quality, environmental quality standard for PFOS. So we can apply that to permitting. It is more difficult for other PFAS. The Environment Agency is exploring using other thresholds, non-statutory thresholds. We're obviously keeping a close eye on what the EU are doing with their newly proposed environmental quality standard. But it does limit in terms of what we can do. Because the science is limited on certain sort of toxicological data and other information around PFAS, it makes it very difficult to require an operator to spend money on abatement or change their processes when the science isn't available to us. So I think this is the PMT concept is very important for that going forward. We're sort of pushing the boundaries of environmental permitting regulations. It's fair to say they weren't necessarily designed, like a lot of chemical legislation and other environmental legislation, designed for sort of groups like PFAS, where you've got that uncertainty when you're really looking at sort of the persistency and the longer term impacts of these. Playing into environmental permitting regulations are sort of water quality regulations. So we have adopted those, or inherited those from the EU. I've already mentioned the environmental quality standard. So we've got that for PFOS. We know that the UK government is looking very closely at what the EU is doing with its new EQS for the sum of around 20 or so PFAS. Another really critical, but I think different and important for a different reason. Important for a different reason as legislation is looking at the legacy contamination. A lot of what the Environment Agency is doing with historic use of PFAS, particularly in things like firefighting foams. Legislation in the UK around contaminated land makes the local authorities or the local councils the primary regulator for that. So this is identifying and inspecting and determining land as contaminated, and therefore enabling some cleanup of that. Now, the local authorities are the primary regulator, but the Environment Agency does regulate the special sites, so those ones with a certain criteria because of their environmental risk or perhaps associated with a permitted activity. So we are supporting local authorities on that. It is an expensive process. It does take time, but it is a strong regulatory tool. Just an aside to that, we have a planning system in the UK that can secure the cleanup of contaminated land through the planning process. That is not it's not quite the same as the regulation around contaminated land, but it is a very effective way of dealing with brownfield sites. Again, that's a local authority planning issue, but the Environment Agency can support through our advice. And then finally, I want to pick up on waste regulation, because restrictions are great. We're absolutely confident that if you restrict a chemical, you will start to see it decrease in environmental concentrations. It is the primary way of dealing with something that the world doesn't want anymore. However, it remains as a legacy in the products. We know through a lot of the work we've done with water companies in England that a lot of these chemicals are coming out of our homes from the products we've got in our homes. So that those products can stay in use for a long, long time. And once they come to the end of life, they're obviously disposed of. Being able to understand where those chemicals are present in waste is really critical in managing it. The UK is far less reliant on landfill, but we have historically used landfill as a method of disposal. Incineration is other than obviously recovery, recycling, but in terms of disposal, incineration is becoming the more preferred method of disposal. Some municipal waste incinerators can destroy these chemicals. Others will need to go to high temperature incineration. So we need to be able to identify where these chemicals are and where legally we can require certain destruction. So, for example, as I mentioned, the pots in waste. We can then enforce those things to be destroyed. Otherwise, we are still looking to track where those chemicals end up in the chain. Colin, that's a very quick overview. I know we were a little bit short of time, just in terms of the regulation that the EA is responsible. There's others that the Drinking Water Inspectorate will do, but I'm not covering that today. But obviously, if things come up in the Q&A afterwards, I can maybe pick that up. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt. A reminder, everyone, if you want to ask us any questions, please put them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat, because that's where we will do them. So next, I'm going to turn to Andreas Kraemer. Andreas, I think you describe yourself as a keen scholar and practitioner of think tanks. And I know that you're the founder and director emeritus of Ecologic Institute in Germany and chairman of the Ecologic Institute in the US, and a long-standing involvement with IEEP. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, my involvement with the IEP started in 1991 when I joined the Bonn office of the organization, and when that closed, for a few months I was a senior fellow. So Nigel was then my boss at the IEP in London, even though I was physically in Berlin. And Ecologic Institute is the German partner of the IEP. That explains the relationship a little bit. I want to do really two things. One is build on Nigel's timeline and look a little bit at the prehistory before 1994 or 2000. And second, give you a little bit of context on Germany, which perhaps helps put what Michael Neumann explained a little bit into perspective. Now, when I look at the PFAS debates today, I am reminded of the debates we had about the chlorinated hydrocarbons, the CHCs, in the 1980s and early 90s. And even then we realized that we were only dealing with a sequel of something that had happened before. In the chemical industry, they had a surplus of chlorine in the 1920s. And in order to solve that waste management problem of the surplus chlorine, they invented PVC, in the beginning an unstable substance, which they deposited. That was dangerous in its own right. So they looked for ways to stabilize it in some ways, and then they added stabilizers and they added other substances. And basically, PVC, which started as a waste management problem, became an early example of the circular economy in a perverse way, because the chemical industry actually transferred or converted the waste into lasting products with some positive qualities, beneficial qualities for industry. And basically, instead of disposing of the waste in a proper way as a waste, they converted it into products and pushed it into the market. And that is a pattern that has been repeated ever since. Whenever we see that there is an unknown mixture of hydrocarbons, one of the solutions that the chemical industry goes for is to halogenate it, to add chlorine or then later more fluoride atoms to the chains in order to homogenize the mixture and create new substances that can be better controlled. They have some properties that allow them to be used as solvents or other things. That is where we went into the CHC. Again, the same problem, we had that. And when we phased out the CHCs, later on the CFCs, it was pretty clear that the chemical industry proposed alternative molecules that were similarly hydrocarbons, halogenated to the extent necessary and possible, and they were pushing them onto the market. So PFAS today is really the fourth or the fifth chapter of a waste management story that started about 100 years ago with PVC. We have not learned any of the lessons from the previous iterations. It remains difficult, as Nigel and Michael have described. It remains difficult to regulate substances. We're still forced into the default way to regulate chemicals is still one by one. And it's only now recently that we learned to deal with larger groupings of chemicals. And I hope that the conceptual invention of the PMT concept will actually help us accelerate in that way. So I just wanted to add this as a prehistory to the timeline that, as Nigel has written, there's always history before history, and you can always go back another century if you like. But I think it is essential to understand the following point, and that is context in Germany, its role in the EU, and what to expect. And here the first message is Germany is bipolar. On the one hand, we have wonderfully dedicated progressive people who care about the environment and they develop new concepts like Michael Neumann. On the other hand, we have an incumbent chemical industry that is deadly conservative and retrograde in its outlook and in its behavior towards regulators. And you can have both of those things at the same time. It actually translates into a phenomenon in Brussels that you could say Germany is speaking with a forked tongue. When the Council of Ministers meets in the environment formation, you hear some green talk, and when the the Council of Ministers meets in the industry formation, you hear some anti-environmental business talk. And whenever a decision is taken away from the Council of Ministers and is transferred to the European Council, so the heads of state and government decide, which they shouldn't be doing, but increasingly they do, then it goes up to the German Chancellery and it regularly sides with the industry side of things rather than the environmental side. On that basis, my prediction is that as this dossier is heating up towards the end of the year, and we are going to see political pressure in Brussels about whether to restrict PFAS or not, at some point there will be an intervention by the German Chancellery with von der Leyen, and that will then translate into either cascading down the Commission services, or it will go to the European Council, where my prediction is, and I'm sorry to say that, Michael Neumann, that the pro-industry voices will win over and definitely get a delay in the regulation, but possibly also get a watering down or an abandoning of certain concepts. We will see how that is. The other thing I think that is important to understand is the role of water supply companies. Water suppliers in Germany are not controlled by the government. They are emanations of local government, so they are municipally owned, the majority, vast majority of them. They're privatized in the sense that they're run like private companies, but they're owned by the municipalities. And they are the ones that are deeply affected by the widespread PFAS pollution, as well as pollution with other substances that are not PFAS. So they have developed the necessary skills for chemical analysis, and they've developed the communication skills in order to talk to the population and talk to policymakers about that. And that explains, in my view, in part, why there is a space within the German political system for actually talking creatively about how to regulate PFAS, and there is a growing willingness to see that there is a need to regulate PFAS. So in that sense, yes, there is a political momentum in that direction, but at the same time, we have a deeply conservative and retrograde chemical industry that I predict will at some point intervene. So those are my most important things. And the final comment is perhaps that when we look at the chemical policy, in German we have two words. One is Chemikalienpolitik, regulation of chemical substances. The other one is Chemiepolitik, which is really an industrial policy addressing the chemical industry as a sector and seeking its transformation into something that is better than what we have at the moment. And yes, there is a lot of attention on the regulation of chemicals, and whereas we did have Chemiepolitik, an industrial policy, industrial transformation policy that was being discussed in the 1980s and 90s. That has been lost. There are a few initiatives that still keep the memory of that thought alive, of that concept alive, but there is currently no strong momentum. And as long as the German chemical industry is good at incremental innovation, it is not good disruptive innovation, and as long as I think that we're going to have to.
I think, Andreas, you've been cutting out at the end of that talk. I think your signal was weakening a bit.
My last words were thank you. I'm not quite sure where you lost me.
You talked about the difference between regulation of chemicals and chemical policy for the industry, and there wasn't much of the latter left anymore, and that's where we lost you.
Okay, then I think it's clear. There is the chemicals regulation, there is the chemical Chemiepolitik as an industrial policy aiming as a transformation, an ecological transformation of the chemical industry. And this latter part, Chemiepolitik, is something that is now only a faded memory from the 1980s and 90s, and doesn't have much of political momentum, neither in the environmental community nor on the side of regulators or industrial policymakers. So, and as long as that persists in Germany, we will continue on the way, regulate chemicals one by one with the time delays that Nigel already described. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Okay, so moving now to our next panelist. This is Shosha Adie, who is a senior reporter at ENDS Report, and her focus is on chemical regulation, post-Brexit, water policy, and net zero. I can't think of a better combination for this particular conversation. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? All right. Brilliant. So just to start out with, I'm not an expert and I do write for the environmental policy magazine ENDS Report. But the great thing about my job is that I get to speak to a lot of experts, I get to read a lot and then write about it to sort of tell people what's going on. And I'm going to bring it back to the UK context, but I thought it was really interesting hearing what everyone was speaking about, because I know that in the UK, the HSC is currently, I think it's still open, running a survey on sort of introducing these EU hazard classes here, including the PMT concept. I know that with our breaking news on TFA, 98% of surface water sites in the UK that were tested for this by the University of York last year showed high levels of TFA, some of which were the highest levels globally. And on sort of this definition of PFAS, because I think it's been clear it's a huge group, there's no sort of universally agreed definition. In the UK, in the recent PFAS action plan, I'm going to stumble over PFAS a lot there, it's a bit of a tongue twister. We're using, yes, the OECD definition of it, which is fluorinated substances that include at least one fully fluorinated methyl or methylene carbon atom, without certain atoms attached to it, and with a few noted exceptions, and you can find that one online. It's quite useful as sort of a basis for policy. So going into the health impacts, which is what I've been asked to talk about today, studies on PFAS have linked them to sort of endocrine disruption, immune suppression disorders, obesity, elevated cholesterol levels, heart problems, and cancer. And that's, you can read actually a lot more about that at the Royal Society of Chemistry in their journal. It's important to say that the only PFAS that is currently listed as a Group 1 human carcinogen, I believe, and that's by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, is PFOA, which interestingly was of course regulated more after PFOS. PFOS is listed as a possible carcinogen, which I believe is category 2. And of course, as you've heard and as you read or will read in Nigel's great timeline, these are the main PFAS that have been sort of at the centre of this global regulatory action, even if it took a while. But yes, according to research by the Royal Society of Chemistry, a number of other PFAS have been linked to toxic impacts in animal studies, and maybe I can share that link afterwards. PFAS have already been recognised as emerging environmental contaminants that end up building up in our organs, and we know that, I'm going to read this one properly off my sheet, perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, PFHXS, has joined PFOS and PFOA and being categorised as a POP, persistent organic pollutant. I'm trying to not do the acronyms. Yes, under the International Stockholm Convention on POPs. So yeah, things are moving and changing, but it's taken a while. And now moving on to sort of the scale of this PFAS pollution, in early 2023, which is sort of when I sort of started becoming more aware of this topic, the Forever Pollution Project showed that nearly 23,000 sites all across Europe are contaminated by PFAS. And then a scoping study that I obtained from the Environment Agency for a Freedom of Information request a few years ago estimated that there could be up to sort of over 10,000 high-risk PFAS sites in England alone. And the costs of the cleanup the costs of cleaning up those chemicals were estimated to range from 31 billion to 121 billion. We ran this story with the Times, and interestingly, when this price tag was attached, people took a lot more notice. So yeah, I feel like that was a really interesting study commissioned by the EA, and I do sometimes wonder why it takes a FOI request for these to be put into the public domain. But yes, so from that we can see that PFAS is a widespread issue across Europe and also across the world and in the UK, which is where I focus my research. Some of our biggest breakthroughs at ENDS, which I just want to quickly mention, because I know we want to get to the Q&A, have been in Bentham, which is a town on the Lancashire border you may or may not have heard of. It's actually my colleague Pippa Neal, who's now just joined The Guardian, who led on this. But it started with a series of Freedom of Information requests in 2023 and 2024 that revealed that groundwater on a local site owned by the big foam manufacturer Angus Fire recorded a PFAS sum of over 1 million nanograms per litre in 2008. For context, I think the UK Drinking Water Inspectorate and the EU advises a 100 nanogram limit on the sum of certain PFAS in drinking water. And within this sum, very high levels of PFOA and PFOS. More recently, if you want to read more about that, I'm sure you can find it's in the cover. It's in The Guardian too, because I know we have a paywall and not everyone is an END subscriber. But more recently, Pippa conducted blood tests of the people living within 1 kilometre of this factory in Bentham, and that was in partnership with ITV Exposure. And a third of residents' results were higher than the standards than the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine would flag as a potential for adverse health effects. We use this standard because we don't have a UK one. Oh, my room has decided I've done enough talking, so it's turned the lights off on me. But yes, so 9 of the 39 people that were tested by Pippa and ITV had PFAS levels above, well, I've just written above 20 here, well, above the level that would see them as being in the highest risk category for adverse effects for PFAS. And on top of this, nearly everybody tested was above the average level of PFAS in the US, where biomonitoring has taken place. 2/3 of them were in the top 5% for levels of PFAS in their blood. So if you want to learn more about this, you can check out the documentary, which is actually online now. I think it's called In Our Blood, and that's with ITV Exposure. There's been a lot that's happened since Pippa first started reporting on this, including some of our first legal action that involves, I'm not going to go into that now, but there's basically a lot that's come out from this. So that reporting really did leave its mark. And the last case that I just wanted to mention was more recently, blood testing has also been called for at a separate site in Thornton Cleverleys, also Lancashire area, north of Blackpool. We ran an ENDS investigation into PFOA contamination at the AGC Chemicals site. Important to say, this is actually on the site of the former Imperial Chemicals Industry factory, which did use PFOA in huge quantities between the 1950s and 2012 to make PTFE, which is used in non-stick cookware. According to a document that was seen by ENDS, during this period, around 49 tonnes of PFOA was emitted to the air, and PFOA has been found in shallow soil samples nearby, and the produce grown in local allotments, which has led to a warning for local people not to eat the produce from there, because it might expose them to harmful levels of PFOA. Again, that one has been categorised as a carcinogen for humans. So I think I will wrap up there just so we can get to the Q&A, but I do want to say, again, I'm not an expert and was sort of blissfully unaware of everything going on in the early 2000s because I was still a toddler. But I do think what these studies are showing us, and what we're finding out is showing us that it really is shocking how much was known about PFAS, but not necessarily shared yet with the public. And I think, maybe we would have even seen faster regulation had it been known. And my big questions are, why has this taken so long to be phased out? What is all the information that we did have? Why was it kept out of the public domain? And sort of what do we do now? So yes, and I know that Kraemer talked about how in Germany there's sort of these pushes against the blanket ban, but in the UK we're still a little bit far away from even getting to that point of having our own blanket ban that can be pushed back against by industry. So yeah, I think there's a lot that needs to happen here, and it's exciting to see some movement.
Thank you very much indeed. So that's the opening remarks from our panel. I hope everyone has found there something for them. There was policy, there was politics, there was science, there was regulation, there was real life impact, there was even a bit of history. And as the only non-historian from my family, I particularly appreciated that from Andreas. So please do put your questions into the Q&A. We've got a couple there already that we'll come to. But before that, I'm going to start off by asking each of the panelists a question in turn. And I'm going to cycle back to Nigel. And actually, Shosha just asked the question, Nigel, which is, why has it taken so long? What's your thinking about why it's taken us all so long to get here? And there are different elements that different people have said, but what's your take on that?
I would say the biggest obstacle to action is that it has not become political, that it has been a technical discussion, very difficult to understand, and so not much written about by people who don't understand it. And it doesn't reach the politicians who don't raise it. There was a brief moment when British politicians did take an interest. Alan Michael was the minister who, at the time of the PFOS restriction, was quite active. But since then, ministers have not discussed chemicals policy. You're silent. You're silent.
Sorry, I was being a good boy and putting myself on mute, and then I forgot. Michael, you wanted to come in on that.
No, I wanted to give you the signal that you're silent.
Andreas, I saw you nodding when Nigel was talking. Did you want to reflect on what he said about why?
I agree with the why. Yes, the technical side of it, the complexity of it. In addition, chemical regulation is now a European policy, which means that the space for national action is greatly reduced, and that reduces the interest for politicians. There's just no room for political entrepreneurship at the national level if the matter is regulated at the European level. So I think that needs to be put into the picture as well. In Germany, we have the specific, it's quite amazing that we do have a very large number of think tanks in Germany. You may know the Wuppertal Institute, the Öko Institute, you may know Ecologic Institute. There are a handful of others, or two handful of others. And very few of them have substantive teams working on chemicals. Some of them do, they're relatively small teams, and nobody is now really working. We have not been able to build up a competence center that is outside of government structures to think about possible futures for the chemical industry. And in that sense, the regulation of the chemicals and the transformation of the chemical industry is not part of the normal environmental policy discourse in Germany. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there was no public funding going into research and into stakeholder processes or anything else in order to build a knowledge base and the networks that you need in civil society before it can actually talk up an issue so that it becomes politically salient.
Thank you. I can't resist, before I let Matt coming in, to put a plug in for an organisation called ChemTrust Europe, which is based in Germany and which does do work both in Germany and at the EU level on chemicals policy. So have to plug them. I am closely associated with them, so it's not a dispassionate plea. Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I do agree with what's been said around political interest, and that is often fueled by media interest. So hats off to the likes of Pip and Neil for raising these issues. I think it's really important. It does attract government's attention. However, I also want to sort of stick up here for the scientists and the regulators who have to do this work. The Environment Agency, like most regulators, is very much a science-led, evidence-based organisation. We've got to remember that we know a huge amount about PFAS now, and that information is increasing all the time. I'd say the research is exponential globally, looking at the amount of papers that have been published. That information wasn't so available in the past about other PFAS. It does take time to do that. If you're going to go and restrict a chemical that can have social and economic impacts, you need to be making sure that you've got that evidence. I would also, though, support, and the Environment Agency support, the precautionary approach. So this is a good example of what we're doing with the HSE, as I mentioned, on the firefighting foam restriction. It just said, well, let's ban them all. There are other products out in the market. They are effective. That's the approach that we have taken alongside the HSE, and that's the recommendation that we're making to the UK government. I'd also want to point out that during these periods that we're talking about, Nigel, your timeline is absolutely brilliant. It's great. I really do like it. There are other chemicals that regulators in the UK and across the EU have been focused on. So, PFAS aren't the only nasty things out there. There are an awful lot of other unpleasant chemicals that we've managed to restrict. And just to sort of highlight what's going on at the moment in the UK is that a Lords Committee has got an ongoing inquiry into pet parasite medication. So these are flea and tick treatment stuff. We're detecting them in the environment frequently, and so obviously that has that profile of that has been raised in the media as well. There are other chemicals out there that regulators have been focused on. It's not that we've taken our eye completely off the ball with PFAS. We've got a lot on our regulatory plate, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So, Shosha, you asked that question about why is it taking so long. I don't know if you've got any reflections on it, and at the same time, I'd be really interested in your observations and reflections on the implications of it having taken so long. What, clearly there are problems. What does your work show as being the implications and the effects on communities and human health around the UK of those delays? So, any reflections on the delay itself and then the impacts?
Yes, I still think the delay does seem quite huge, and the work on pet medicines we also cover at ENDS report because that's really important too. But I think just the fact that PFAS is such a huge group, and it was sort of making people a lot of money to have these sort of products come out, and yet the regulations didn't catch up. And we do actually have a recent story on this that might be quite an interesting case study that brings in the elements of that question. Pippa again wrote this one, but we uncovered, I talked about AGC chemicals earlier, and actually we recently got a document back which showed there was a meeting in 2000 between quite a few chemical companies at a Scottish castle, which was, they were sort of discussing PFOA, and they found out it caused serious health impacts to monkeys in laboratory experiments. It sounds very, Scottish castle experiments, but yeah, please do go and read this one. I think it is quite interesting. But yeah, every single monkey that was involved in this study to look at the impacts of PFOA experienced an increase in liver weight, which is a sign of toxicity. And yeah, it meant that the people that were present at the meeting could establish a no effect level for PFOA. So this is just one sort of instance of where the industry was sort of carrying out these studies and seeing that there was likely harms in these chemicals that they were producing on a massive scale. But the regulations, as we see from the timeline, took over a decade to catch up. So I think this is a big question that future generations will be asking as we get more information about them. In fact, another story that we covered at ENDS report was that the Environment Agency was warned more than 20 years ago about the chronic threat of PFAS, and this is going back to firefighting foams, because I believe that report was about fluorosurfactants, the type of PFAS. And now, of course, firefighters are only starting to realise that they've spent decades being exposed to these chemicals, and the Fire Brigades Union is carrying out testing on its firefighters, and calling on the government to act on this as well. So I think that sort of those case studies hopefully incorporate both of those questions. But yeah, I think people are really concerned, and I think they want the information. I did a study in the Cotswolds where I was contacted by river campaigners who'd seen there were high levels of PFOA in a stream that was leading from a firefighting training site. And they knew that that land was mooted for development under the recent house building drive. And even a primary school was going to be situated in that site. And they just wanted to know, like, is this contaminated land? I believe that it's still an ongoing discussion, but they found it really hard to get sort of information from the regulators and also their local council. And we know that those allotments that I mentioned recently, I believe they've been the first to be classed as, or that area around the AGC factory and the older massive ICI factory is now classed as contaminated land. So I think we're seeing a lot of movement, but the impact on people we're really starting to see now. And I hope it's not another 2 decades before we can really get a grip on this as well.
Thanks very much indeed. Michael, I'll come to you next, if I may. In terms of the question that we started off with, or one of the questions we started off with, what's your sort of assessment of the importance of PMT as a concept for addressing PFAS? You've clearly said it's not the be all and the end all, but is it essential, necessary but not sufficient, or is it something else?
Well, as I said, I think the PMT, developing the PMT concept was kind of the logical step after the POP regulation and PBT regulation, right? It was clearly the protection of water resources in our mind, but it helped to understand that its persistency is really the important intrinsic substance property. So when people were criticizing the long chain PFAS, then industry was switching to the short chain PFAS, but then this would be mobile, would be leaching, would be contaminating the water resources. So this made it clear that if you have very persistent chemicals, they cannot be good in the environment. There is no good persistent chemical in the environment. Where should it go, right? If it's persistent. And so I think that's the main importance of the PMT concept.
Thank you. And Andreas, can I come to you next? So you've talked about this lack of civil society engagement in chemicals issues, perhaps, or perhaps not as much as you would like to see in Germany. And yet one hears a lot about a very green consciousness in Germany, and you said yourself that that's very much the case there. How is the PFAS debate playing into that bipolar German psyche that you mentioned before? Is it starting to make chemicals more interesting, in inverted commas, to the public and therefore to politicians, or is it not having that impact yet?
On PFAS, yes. There are now campaigns. The German government is actually paying some of the environmental organizations to start awareness-raising campaigns, stakeholder processes. So we are beginning to see an investment into building the necessary civil society infrastructure that the government later on will need when it comes to having stakeholder processes to feed into the regulation, to build the credibility of restrictions, for example. But this is in response to PFAS as a highly complicated class of substances. It is still an elite discourse, technocratic in Nigel's description. And it doesn't translate into a broader concern about what are we going to do with our chemical industry, which has a huge legacy not only on the halogenated hydrocarbons in all their permutations, including PFAS, but also, for example, in plastics. When you look at the historic responsibility of the German petrochemical industry for the making of plastics and developing technologies around plastics and working with plastics, converting plastics into products. There is a lot of German patents are in that system that gives Germany a historic responsibility also for plastics. It's a similar thing for other types of chemicals or polymers. And we do not have in Germany a broader debate about the collective responsibility that we as Germans have for the good behavior of our industry. We also don't have it in the automobile industry. So this is not specific to the chemical industry, but it is markedly different from other areas of environmental policy. When you think about water supply, when you think about waste management, recycling, all of those are things that actually capture the imagination, and there is participation in schemes in the German population. But in chemicals, yes, PFAS, people get excited about it. Chemical policy at large, no, that's too complicated, too far away, and they're not engaged.
Thank you. Matt, a final question from me to you before we turn to the Q&A box, which is filling up nicely, by the way. One of the questions, it seems to me, for the Environment Agency in England is where does the environment end and human health start, or put it the other way around? Because as you say, you know, EA is responsible for environment, but it's really hard to separate that from human health. And so, for example, Shosha was talking about a couple of examples of human biomonitoring. I don't know that EA would ever think of doing human biomonitoring. You could tell me differently, but is that one of the things that you want to talk to other agencies about? Who worries about chemicals in humans apart from in the workplace, I guess, is my question underpinning that.
Yeah, well, I think we all do. I think this is the concern. I think it's really interesting as well when you're looking at society. Chemicals are unseen, aren't they? And I think that, you know, the idea that everything's toxic and it's, you know, in our bodies is really scary thought. So I think this is one of the issues. But you're right. The Environment Agency isn't primarily a human health regulator. There are other regulators in the UK and in England that have that role, whether that's for food, for drinking water. And then we obviously got the UK Health Security Agency, which is responsible sort of the general population around that. And then we have local health, not just through the NHS, but also through local councils. However, that's not to say that what the Environment Agency considers, and then when it does its regulation and looking at risk assessment, we don't ignore that human health aspect. So our primary objective is looking at the health and protecting the environment, but obviously humans depend on the environment, so exposure to chemicals through the environment is really critical to us. So primarily what we do is provide our monitoring data for chemicals and for PFAS to our partners. I mean, it is published anyway, but we will highlight risks. So if you're looking at, for example, public drinking water sources, if we are looking at levels of concern of PFAS in those supplies, we have obviously shown that information with the Drinking Water Inspectorate, with the water companies, but we've also done similar with private water supplies that are regulated by the local authorities, local councils. So we provide that information to the owner of that private supply, but also the regulator and the council. So we're working with all these groups. Shosha's mentioned the contaminated land inspection that is ongoing around AGC chemicals in the northwest of England. Behind the work that the Environment Agency are leading on behalf of the council, there is a technical cell, there's a health cell providing that expertise on human health concerns from those organisations I've mentioned. This isn't just one regulator doing its thing, ignoring what others are doing. We work very collaboratively with all the regulators, particularly on these site-specific issues. We speak regularly as within a group around PFAS, so there's good communication. And I think that is so critical. We've all got different remits. We've all got different legislation that we are responsible for, that government has asked us to do, but we can't do that in isolation. On the point around human biomonitoring, again, it's outside of our responsibility. I would turn to UK HSA for the expertise on that. There does seem to be a lot of sense around focusing on higher risk populations, or certainly in terms of occupational exposure, but that's not really for the environment. We just don't have the expertise on the sort of human biomonitoring side of things. It's more exposure through the environment that we are trying to look at. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Matt. Nigel, you wanted to come in?
Yes, in the discussion of who's responsible for human health, nobody has mentioned the UK Health Security Agency, which is actually the body which is supposed to be, and they did, to be responsible for human health. They did submit evidence to the Environment Audit Committee report, and they admitted that they themselves had not done any human biomonitoring for PFAS, but they were building up capacity to evaluate such studies on such human biomonitoring was done by other people. So they do recognize that they have a responsibility, but they are not adequately in the middle of the debate about this. I mean, the fact that they're not mentioned, we haven't mentioned them up till now, and that the Environment Audit Committee hardly mentioned them, I think is very surprising. And they really ought to be at the center of the debate about PFAS, because the major impact of PFAS is on human health. It's not on wildlife or the environment generally. It is on human health.
Michael, you wanted to come in?
Yes, if I may, I have a question to Matt. Looking at these new hazard classes that we have moved into the CLP regulation, and this is a clear classification and labeling instrument. So you mentioned all these different regulations, but here it's nicely in one place. We also call about one substance, one assessment approach. How do you see this to help in the other regulations to help minimizing emissions into the environment, basically then to reduce the exposure of humans via the environment? And specifically, what do you think about the TFA classification? Will there be a chance that UK will copy this classification?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, these are probably primarily questions for government who lead on the policy. But what I would say, the CLP classification, label and packaging regulations are fundamental to a lot of regulations that the Environment Agency is responsible for. So that is not just on the chemical side, and we obviously pay close attention to this. In England, if people weren't aware, the HSE lead, the policy leads for CLP. However, we obviously, since we, even as part of the EU, we would follow what the Global Harmonised System of Classification would do, and we are still following that. Obviously, the EU is moved ahead a little bit more quickly. At the moment, UK government has made it pretty clear that it is looking to align more closely on chemical legislation, particularly REACH, with the EU, and would only diverge in exceptional circumstances. So that's the current government's policy on that. There's a lot of advantages in doing that. We can see the EU going first on these things. We get to sort of take a step back and have a look at that. I think it's a sensible thing. Probably a lot of people are aware that the UK government has an interim position published on PMT. That was done into support of our work and HSC's work on the restriction we've worked on PFAS. It was needed to be able to bring all of those PFAS into that restriction rather than just those with sort of known toxic persistent, bioaccumulative properties. So yeah, I think it's a sensible way to do that. There is a gap with a lot of those hazard classes under CLP. So I think it's very good. It supports the precautionary principle which is embedded in UK legislation. So thanks, Michael.
So I'm going to pick, thanks very much indeed, Matt. I'm going to pick some questions from the Q&A now. Some of them people on the panel are answering. So if you are in the audience and you've asked a question and I don't get to it, do check the Q&A box under answered, because some of them may well appear there. And I'm not going to do them in the order they appear because I'm not going to. And I'm going to start off actually with one from Neil Hunt. His question is, if an issue similar to PFAS emerges in the future, what tools do the UK regulators have to understand how, where and how much of such substances are used and then released in the UK? Will the proposed ATRM in UK REACH assist in this? And I'm going to address that, Matt, to you in the first instance, but then I'm going to ask Michael and Andreas if they have any thoughts from an EU perspective, how that would be answered in an EU perspective. But Matt, specifically in the UK context.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I see that's pick it up there. So there's two things here. I'll deal with the REACH side of things first, because as I said, the primary regulator for REACH in the UK is the HSE. Obviously, the government is setting a policy on that. They've recently announced some sort of, or they're looking, debating in Parliament at the moment some further delays to the registration timescale. So we have lagged behind a little bit in the sense of since we've left the EU on that. This is critical in terms of new registrations, existing registrations, but for new registrations. So if you've got, let's say, we get rid of PFAS, someone invents a new class of chemicals that we all think is fantastic, it does the same job and it's got no risks whatsoever. Until 10 years later, we find out it's turning up where it shouldn't turn up, and we now think that there's some human health and environmental risk with it. So REACH should be looking to continue to do that. I think both the EU and the UK government need to look at how how we've managed PFAS and the delays that have been discussed, and see what needs to be done in terms of improving the regulation, chemical legislation around that, how advances in technology can improve the information around sort of toxic effects, all of these things, and get it more quickly. This is one of the problems with the delays. It takes a lot of time to gather this evidence. It takes a lot of time to demonstrate the evidence shows that these chemicals do cause harm. I think you've mentioned IR already, Shosha, in terms of that building up of evidence about things that are carcinogenic. It takes many studies, many years to convince experts that is even just a possible carcinogen. So that could speed up. But I think that's the government to keep that under review. As I've already said, we are UK government is very much looking towards developments in EU REACH as well. There is another aspect to this, and that is in relation to understanding what the risks are, and it all comes down to exposure. One of the things the Environment Agency does, it has a prioritisation and early warning system. We developed this a few years ago. The basis of this is to look at where we've got it, environmental monitoring data or other evidence, scientific papers, and looking at new emerging chemical risks, and we take them through this sort of screening process and try and prioritize those substances. And these are nominated internally or by our co-regulators or academics, and we will take them through this process. And this is trying to understand the risks of the future. So we have done these flea and tick treatments through that. We've looked at those. We've looked at other pesticides, other substances that may not even be listed on REACH because they're coming in to the country in products or in volumes of less than 1 tonne per annum. Now that's quite a critical thing, because some of these substances, the quantities used are so small, but we're starting to be able to detect these in the environment now. And we know that for certain substances, you don't need high concentrations to cause chronic impacts. So things can fall through the net in terms of REACH, but this process, this prioritisation early warning system, PEWS, is designed to look at those, inform our monitoring or inform our research and inform our regulation, and to inform our partners and government. So I'll leave it there for someone else to come in. Colin, thanks.
Thank you, Matt. Michael, from an EU perspective, how would you answer that question about, do we have the tools and mechanisms in place to spot this in the future?
Well, looking at this PFAS crisis, you ask yourself really, well, how could that happen, right? Why was there no mechanism to hinder it? And in my view, it's really necessary to regulate based on intrinsic substance properties, right? We cannot wait till the environment has been contaminated and then wake up and start regulation. And what I mean by regulation is we really need to minimize the emissions, right? It's not about a total ban of everything. It's really the emissions into the environment that needs to be controlled and to be minimized. So it's a generic risk approach that we should go if we see that certain intrinsic substance properties are there. And for PFAS, you can clearly say that every emission is a proxy of risk. Every emission into the environment will at one day sooner or later come back to you and cause a risk. So you do not do, it's not, you do not need to do a full risk assessment. You already know that it's not a good idea to emit these kind of chemicals into the environment. And this is what I really would hope for, that this is the last time that something like this happened.
Thank you very much. There's another question in the chat that's that Andreas has been engaging with in typing, but I think still would be worth sharing with the panel. Interested to hear if any of the presenters has thoughts on what are the solvable barriers and frictions for effective reporting and regulation. So what's stopping us from becoming aware of these problems sooner, I think, is the way I would rephrase that. And Shosha, I was wondering if from your perspective as a journalist who's been trying to expose some of these things, whether you've got some immediate reflections on that.
I guess speaking from a personal perspective here, I would say that possibly we have an issue in the UK with our political cycles, because you don't get much time to sort of tackle something as big as PFAS. So you sort of go for those low-hanging fruits that you'd be able to say at the end of your your time in government that you've managed to tackle them. So I think that is an issue. But I would go back to saying again, the fact that we've had to uncover so much of this through FOI requests, and some which initially really it was a real challenge to get stuff back from. And there's lots of reasons why a FOI request can be refused, but some of them did feel a bit not quite right. So yeah, I would say that having the information in the public domain so that people can push it up the political agenda is a huge way to sort of remove that barrier. And I do believe the EA is actually publishing a lot more data going forward. So this seems to be like a quite good point at the moment. And from sort of another perspective as well, if you publish this FOI data, it doesn't have to be found by journalists, then maybe, people will be like, oh, wow, you've done quite a lot of research and it's great to see all of that research, rather than, hang on a second, how have you managed to sit on this for so long? So it can also lead to much more positive discussions around this too. So I think transparency is key, really being able to push this up political agendas and, ending that sort of short-termism that we've seen in current political cycles.
Excellent. Michael, you were next.
Yeah, in my view, it's really the in-compliance with the REACH regulation, right? It's the huge data gaps that we have in the registration dossiers. We simply still live in the no data, no problem situation that we wanted to overcome with the REACH regulation. And I'm coming back to the persistency because this is my field of expertise. But if you look at those chemicals that are already in the environment, that are already a contaminant of our water, 50% of those chemicals we cannot conclude on the degradability, on the persistency of these chemicals, because we simply don't have data for them. We are missing test data, and these persistency test data are extremely cheap. You do not need to have a radioactive labeled test compound if you look at a persistent, non-degradable compound, then you just can run the test, and the chemical will stay in your test system over the test duration, and you just need a good analytical approach. But there's no need for an expensive radioactive marking of the test compound. So we should really, and the beauty of persistency testing, it doesn't involve animal testing. So it's a test system where the society really should request that it is run for every chemical, because it's such an important intrinsic substance property. And so in my view, it's the data gap, it's the missing data, and probably looking at the human tox and environmental tox or bioaccumulation properties, you probably can come to a similar conclusion.
Thank you, Michael. Matt, you were next, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a few things. I've mentioned obviously data and science being absolutely critical to that, and I think we can take lessons that we've learned over the years, and we do in terms of how we apply data to regulation, to risk assessments. We're building on that. There are a couple of other things I want to mention. I do get what Shosha is saying about the transparency. So obviously a bit of a plug for DEFRA's PFAS plan. They are going to put a dedicated website on PFAS. Public. I think it's so important. What I would challenge is that the information request aspect of that, we want to make our information available, as do other regulators. There are limitations to that, but the environmental information regulations, which is the sort of the FOI equivalent, if you like, are designed to allow the public access to environmental information. They're very much supported by the Environment Agency and others. So it's a really powerful tool. It's a separate thing to FOIs, freedom of information. It is there for particularly around monitoring. All of our monitoring is published. It's not very accessible. I have to accept that. It's not, unless you are used to data analysis and can use the system. There's a lot more we can do. Regulators generally commission reports to help inform, either through our science, but inform our regulation, inform our assessment. There's a lot of that. It's already been mentioned that there's the economic assessment that we've had done. They're not always commissioned to go in the public domain, but we're more than happy to make them available, as we have done with ENDS. There is another really important point that I see as a regulator for chemicals on this, and that is the global market's whole supply chain stuff. So we also regulate persistent organic pollutants. We regulate mercury. We've done some studies, for example, on mercury and skin lightening creams, found exceptionally high levels of mercury in these creams that people apply obviously to their skin. That's a worry in itself. But when they've washed it, it's all going down the drain. It's all going through sewage works. It's all coming out in the environment. It's probably changing to a far more hazardous form of mercury, and it's serious. Now, those are illegal products, and we've removed those from the market. But when we've spoken to others, a lot of these people, particularly at the end of these supply chains, they don't know what's in their product. We've been contacted by big multinational companies, household names, and saying, really sorry, we've realized we've put a product on the market that contains a banned persistent organic pollutant, because they've been able to trace that back to the original producers. That is hard. And even with labeling and everything, that is a real challenge for us, and it will be a challenge for others. And just because it needs to be said, regrettable substitution, this idea that we'll replace that thing with something that's a little bit similar, but it doesn't at the moment show to be harmful because the tests haven't got that far. That's something we need to get on. And the whole, as I say, the grouping approach to that's been discussed by others is part of that, and the whole precautionary principle is part of that too. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to cycle back a little bit, but also respond to the questions by William Wilson and David Tompkins. First of all, the discussion here has been, do we have enough evidence? I remember the time when we were discussing individual substances, partially halogenated CFCs at the time, and there were representatives from industry coming into the meeting room with folders full of studies and of data, which they then had in the room whilst the substance was discussed. And at the end of the meeting, they took all the stuff away with them, refusing to hand them over, citing commercial confidentiality reasons. I think we need to get away from that and establish a duty to publish all that information, irrespective of who paid for it. And commercial confidentiality must take second place to public health interest in this. So that would immediately enhance the data and information base, but it would still require us to do all the analysis and produce all the data. And here I would encourage all of you to look at experience in the pharmaceutical industry, which is now using in silico experiments, meaning that they use computer models in order to assess substances of pharmaceutical potential, of promise, and then try to optimize them so that they're better soluble, more stable, more effective, fewer side effects. And all of this is done by computers that are increasingly more powerful. And it's actually obviating a great need for animal testing, because when you go into animal testing, you've weeded out all the unlikely candidates already. So fewer animals will suffer because you already go into the process with the really most promising after in silico testing. If we apply that to chemicals, then I think we would find that any substitution that substitutes a partly halogenated or fully halogenated hydrocarbon with another one is going to be one of those regrettable substitutions. And we have seen that from CFCs, from CHCs to CFCs to partially halogenated substitutes. We are seeing it over and over again. And behind that, I want you to understand is the chemical industry needs chlorinated hydrocarbons on the market because that's a way of solving a waste management problem they have. They take waste and they convert it into products and they dump it on society. That's their business model. And that plays into the question of David Tompkins. We really need to rethink the structure in which the chemical industry is organized. And the German chemical industry, focusing on incremental innovation, improvements at the margins, will never question the main trunk of the production system, and that is at the heart of the problem here. Thank you. I guess that was my final statement already.
Thank you, Andreas. Nigel. You're still on mute, Nigel.
This is to support Michael's point about persistence. ChemSec, a fortnight or so ago, had a short webinar on persistence. And the idea was developed there, any substance that was persistent should be suspect. Whether you can then say that if you invent a new substance which is persistent, you should not be allowed to market at all. So you don't have to go through the risk assessments. I don't know whether that's realistic, but that is obviously being thought about. And really what I'm saying is that is on the table. It's being discussed.
Thank you. Yes. Would any panelist like to make any further closing comment before I make a very haphazard attempt at summarizing what's been an intensely interesting and wide-ranging conversation? Shosha.
I would like to make just one sort of last tiny comment on sort of transparency, because I think in terms of the FOIs, I thought back to sort of a river summit that I attended in 2024 when the chief executive of the Environment Agency said that a lot of local officers aren't replying to FOI requests or EIR requests because they're coming in great volumes. And I quote, often they know the answer, but it's embarrassing. They're not doing it because they're bad people. This is the quote: they are worried about revealing the true state of what's going on. They're worried about reaction from NGOs and others, and possibly from the government about the facts of the situation. Now, that's in relation to the sewage scandal, which has made headlines a lot in the UK. But I do think it can also apply to this sort of chemicals issue too, where I think there's this internal reaction where we see something bad, especially if we think it might come back to us, that we try and sort of hide what's going on or wait till someone else is, takes a step forward. But I think we all have to take a step forward, and that includes me as well, when it comes to this issue, because it is a huge issue. And, you know, as we've seen from this timeline, if we want to speed things up, I think action across the board is needed, and a bit more sort of stepping forward and taking responsibility too.
Thank you. Andreas, your hand is up. I'm not sure if it's a legacy or if you wanted to come back in. Cool. Thank you very much indeed. Nigel, I think I'm going to give you the penultimate word.
Okay. Well, just to say that in my paper that you've got, it ends up with the question whether PFAS is the PFAS saga is another late lesson from early warnings. This is a reference to the 2 volumes published by the European Environment Agency some time ago, listing 34 case studies where there had been technological developments which people at the time when they were first developed warned as being very dangerous and shouldn't be proceeded with, but were proceeded with. And we then later learnt that there were real harms and they had to be restricted. The question is whether PFAS fits that. Is it a late lesson? And we knew at the time of the restriction of PFOS that some PFASs were harmful. What I don't know is whether people were saying, look, there's a whole huge family of PFAS, all of which are likely to be harmful, not least because they are persistent. And I'm not sure that anybody said that. Now, if anybody did say that, and anybody here who's listening to this webinar knows that, please will they tell me, because David G., who masterminded those European Environment Agency reports, says that the European Environment Agency is thinking of doing another issue and is looking for examples, and perhaps PFAS is an example. So I would like to know.
I think it's a really interesting one. Speaking from my own perspective, as I was involved in chemicals policy at the time of the PFOS restriction in the UK, I remember very clearly conversations in the office. Well, of course, these chemicals are persistent because the carbon-fluorine bond is blooming strong, and it is really hard in nature to break it. And the carbon-chlorine bond is not quite as strong, but it's still pretty strong. So at one level, it was blindingly obvious that these chemicals would be persistent because of their chemistry. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that any of us were out there saying it publicly. It was almost, you didn't kind of go that far with it, perhaps. Perhaps it was too obvious to talk about in that way. But if anyone does have any more contributions to make, I'm sure that IEP would be delighted to receive any further contributions and to funnel them on through to Nigel and others. First of all, huge thanks to our something over 200 participants today. I hope you have found it an interesting and enlightening conversation. For me, I took away 2 broad topics that we talked about as to why these exceptional chemicals are exceptionally difficult to regulate. And not necessarily in priority order. The first bucket is around politics, and I think Andreas was very clear on this, but others made contributions too. Very low public awareness and therefore very low pressure on politicians around chemicals in general and until relatively recently PFAS in particular. The countervailing economic interests, where the incentives to, quote, do the right thing aren't lined up in the right direction. And of course, other distractions. That's my code for the thing that Matt talked about. There were other things that regulators and politicians were worrying about. So it's not just that they were ignoring everything, but they had other preoccupations. And then the second bucket is the sort of complexity of the technical issues, and they overlap, of course. And I mean that in 2 senses. One sense is that it's really hard to work through some of these issues. So the work that Michael talked to us about codifying PMT, that took a lot of effort, a lot of intellectual effort, a lot of scientific effort to codify that and to put it forward in a way that then could have impact. It's really hard sometimes to trace between the emission of a substance, its pathway through the environment, and then its final impact. Those are all complex issues. Matt talked about how much effort it takes to identify a carcinogen and so on. So they're intrinsically complex technical issues. And then that's an incredibly difficult story to tell to the media and to the public, and very, very hard to get the public excited about it in a way that's constructive and helpful. So two big buckets, I think, that make regulation in this space particularly difficult. And then a key takeaway that several people have said, and I think we all need to reflect on, is that persistence is the key. For this category and many other categories of chemicals, if it's persistent in the environment, you should worry about it. Because once it's out there, it's too late. It will not go away of its own accord. And it will cost an awful lot of money to do something about it if there's a problem. And you won't know that there's a problem until it's too late to do something about it, if you're letting it out there. So persistence is a really important point. Huge thanks to our panelists today. Some really insightful contributions, some really excellent presentations. Thank you all very much indeed. And finally, thanks to Ed and the Institute for European Environmental Policy in the UK for pulling this together and getting us all together. Thank you all very much indeed. I hope that it is as sunny for you as it is for me, wherever you are, and that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all very much indeed, and goodbye now.